Namaskar. Once again, you are welcome in the series of literary criticism. In the previous lecture, we discussed John Dryden and his essay on dramatic poesy. Today, I will be focusing on another critic, and that critic is not only a critic, but he is a magistrate. He holds a magisterial status among English literary critics. Many of his utterances are crammed with illumination and entertainment, and his name is here on your screen, Dr. Samuel Johnson, the only doctor who was a critic, who was a poet, who was an essayist, who was a journalist, who was a critic, who was a lexicographer, and who was one of the greatest editors of William Shakespeare. Right? His criticism can be divided into two parts: preface to Shakespeare and except preface to Shakespeare. Whatever he wrote in the form of essays, in the Rambler, in the Idler, and in the biographies, lives of eminent English poets, everywhere his criticism are contained. But he didn't write a single treatise on criticism. He was basically not a critic, but he became a critic through his lives of English poets, through his preface to Shakespeare, and through his articles published in different journals, Rambler, Idler, Adventure, and others. Right? So, in today's class, Dr. Samuel Johnson as a critic. The comment is so wide-ranging that it cannot be neatly summed up under a few heads. We can but select from his material some samples of Johnson's critical acumen in action. The most relevant work, periodical essays in the Rambler and the Idler, the edition of William Shakespeare's plays, and lives of the poets. Dr. Samuel Johnson's biographer, James Boswell, he made this universal statement about Dr. Samuel Johnson: a man of much philosophy, extensive reading, and real knowledge of human life. This is the characteristic of Dr. Samuel Johnson. He was a man of philosophy, man of much philosophy. He is known for his extensive reading, and he had the real knowledge of human life. This is Dr. Samuel Johnson, and the comment was passed by James Boswell, who wrote his biography, Life of Johnson. Johnson was a poet, biographer, lexicographer, critic, novelist, essayist, and dramatist as well. He wrote a tragedy under the title Irene. Right? He wrote a single novel under the title Russells, and he compiled a dictionary that is known as Johnson's Dictionary. He wrote the biographies of 52 poets under the title Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets, Lives of the Poets, and he was a poet as well. He wrote many poems in imitation of Horace, in imitation of Juvenal, the Latin poets. And his criticism is contained in three branches of his work. Three branches of his work: periodical essays in the Rambler and the Idler. These are the names of journals. The edition of Shakespeare, and lives of most eminent English poets. So I have divided his criticism under three heads. First, periodical essays. Second, lives of poets. And the third one, preface to Shakespeare. Preface to Shakespeare, where he counts the merits and demerits of William Shakespeare. merits and demerits of William Shakespeare are counted by Dr. Samuel Johnson in his preface to William Shakespeare. And here I start with his excerpts from different various journals that he wrote about poet, about critic, and about other literary forms, and about other men of literature. From the Valley, part 1 of the History of Russell's. History of Russell's is the only novel that Dr. Samuel Johnson wrote, and here in the novel there is a philosopher, and that philosopher talks about poetry and talks about poet. Who should be a poet and what should be the content of poetry is very much discussed here in the novel, though it is a fictional work and the philosopher himself is fictional, but he talks about very real things. बहुत रियल चीजों की बात करता है कि who should be a poet and what should be the business of a poet. So what does the philosopher say? He says that a poet is to examine not the individual but the species, to remark general properties and large appearances. A poet should not concentrate on a particular being. He should talk about a species, right? He should not talk about Dr. Johnson. He should not talk about Dryden, but he should talk about entire human being. He should talk about entire writings, entire writers. ये ऑब्जेक्टिव होना चाहिए, बिजनेस होना चाहिए एक पोएट का, as Dr. Johnson suggests in his essay, in his novel, The History of Russell's. A poet, to a poet, nothing is useless. Nothing can be useless. Whatever is beautiful and whatever is dreadful must be familiar to his imagination. Everything what pleases and everything what displeases must be in the mind of a poet. Right? उसके mind में होना चाहिए. He must be conversant. All that is awfully vast or elegantly little. Right? Little and vastness doesn't have any value. He must be knowing each and everything. The plants of the garden, the animals of the woods, the minerals of the earth, the meteors of the sky must all concur to store his mind with inexhaustible variety. For every idea is useful for the enforcement of decoration of moral or religious truth. Right? Dr. Samuel Johnson especially focuses on variety. When he defends Shakespeare's mixing of tragedy and comedy, then once again he says variety gives more pleasure. Variety pleases us, so there must be variety. Right? If there is only tragedy, it will be monotonous. If there will only comedy, it will be monotonous. So the mind of the poet must contain all the things beautiful, all the things dreadful, all the particles, all the atoms, whether they are woods, they are forests, they are roads, they are houses, they are cities, they are towns, they are rivers, they are mountains. Everything should be there in the mind of poet, and it means the mind of the poet should be a storehouse, so that everything could be contained there, and whenever occasions come, everything comes out automatically. This is the characteristic of a great poet, as Dr. Samuel Johnson thinks, as Dr. Samuel Johnson suggests. Alright, he who knows most will have most power of diversifying his scenes and of gratifying his reader with remote allusions and unexpected instructions. So this was the first comment about poet by Dr. Samuel Johnson in his novel The History of Russell's. All right. And a poet must divest himself of the prejudices of his age. A poet is not supposed to be biased. A poet should be free from all prejudices of his age and country if he wants to be a universal poet. And if he is involved in petty things, if he is involved in trivial things, he cannot be universal, he cannot be loved by one and all, he should be free, right? Why was Dr. Johnson focusing on such delicate issues? Because he was living in the time of political upheaval. Everybody was aligned to one or other political party, whether he was a Whig or he was a Tory. And if a Whig comments about the Tory, his criticism, his poetry will be biased, right? So Dr. Johnson suggests that a poet should be free from the prejudices of his age and country. He must consider right and wrong in the abstracted and invariable state. He must disregard present laws and opinions. He must disregard present laws and opinions and rise to general and transcendental truth. The existing laws should be discarded. And if a poet has the capacity to discard the existing laws, then he can soar above the sky, which will always be the same. He must content himself with the slow progress of his name, contemn the praise of his own time, and commit his claims to the justice of posterity. He must write as the interpreter of nature and the legislature of mankind. Once again, here you are reminded, एक और पोएट आपको याद आ रहा होगा, पीबी शाली. पीबी शाली के अकॉर्डिंग a poet is an unacknowledged legislator, and the same thing is being said here by Dr. Samuel Johnson, right? Means P.B. Shelley was inspired by Dr. Samuel Johnson and consider himself as presiding over the thoughts and manners of future generations as being superior to the time and place. And if a man is biased, if a poet is prejudiced, if he has the views, if he has the rules, regulations of the current time, he will be a poet. Though he can be a poet, but he will be very short-lived poet. His universality will be curtailed. His labor is not yet an end. He must know many languages and many sciences. Dr. Samuel Johnson himself wrote in 3 languages, and according to whom a poet must be knowing several languages, that is, his style may be worthy of his thoughts, must by incessant practice familiarize to himself every delicacy of speech and grace of harmony. So this was the idea of the poet by Dr. Samuel Johnson in his novel The History of Russell's. Who should be a poet? As I told you, right? A poet should not be biased. The knowledge of nature is only half the task of a poet. He must be acquainted likewise with all the modes of life. A poet must come from the society, right? He must be living in the society, and only then he can have knowledge of all the modes of life. His characters requires that he estimate the happiness and misery of every condition, observe the power of all the passions in all their combinations, and trace the changes of the human mind as they are modified by various institutional and accidental influences, right? Now he comes to an article, and the article was published in his journal The Rambler under the title The Critic. There are 2 essays, The Critic 1 and The Critic 2, published, sorry, not in Rambler, but it was published in the Idler, number 60, Saturday 9th June 1759 by Samuel Johnson. And here he defines critics and criticism. For people, it is very easy to be a critic. You can criticize anybody without even knowing him properly, and this is happening in our existing society. So criticism was on its peak during the neoclassical period. Everybody was trying his hand, and here in the essay The Critic, Dr. Johnson satirizes the very profession of critics, and the very definition of criticism is very much interesting. Criticism is a study by which men grow important and formidable at a very small expense. Right? What is criticism? Criticism is the study by which men grow important and formidable at very small expense. You can be important. You can be thought to be important if you are a critic. The power of invention has been conferred by nature upon few. Only a few people can be creative. Only a few people could be a particular imaginative writer. Not everybody. Right? Only nature has bestowed this special quality of writing on only a few, but anybody can be a critic because it takes little task, right? And very small expense. And the labor of learning those sciences which may by mere labor be obtained is too great to be willingly endured. But every man can exert such judgment as he has upon the works of others. Everybody can pass the judgment about others. And he whom nature has made weak and idleness keeps ignorant may yet support his vanity by the name of a critic. Now see the definition. Who is the critic? The person who cannot invent anything new, who is least imaginative, who is least creative, and the person who is neglected by nature can be a critic, and that nature has made weak. Number one. Number two, idleness keeps ignorant. That person can be a critic, and this is a formidable name. All the other parts of literature are quiet and haughty. They must be long courted, and at last are not always gained. If you are trying to be a great poet, to be a good poet, it is not mandatory that you will be great. You could achieve your desired result. But if you want to be a critic, you can be at any time. किसी भी टाइम पर आप क्रिटिक हो सकते हो. Criticism is a goddess, easy of access and forward of advance, who will meet the slow and encourage the timorous. The want of meaning she supplies with words, and the want of spirit she recompenses with malignity. Now, criticism is a metaphor here. Criticism is a personification here. Now, Dr. Johnson says that criticism is the goddess. Criticism is a goddess for whom? Goddess for those, a goddess for the critics, because it is the goddess easy of access and forward of advance. Anybody can access the goddess of criticism, who will meet the slow and encourage the timorous. And goddess काम क्या करती है? Goddess क्या काम करती है? It meets the slow people and encourages them to be timorous. They can't be courageous. The want of meaning she supports, she supplies with words, and the want of spirit she recompenses with malignity. क्योंकि जो critics होते हैं उनके पास कुछ बताने के लिए तो होता नहीं कि कुछ नया बताएं, तो क्या काम करते हैं? उनके पास खाली वर्ड्स होते हैं, शब्द होते हैं, और दूसरी जो है उनकी इंटेंशन होती है, वो इंटेंशनली अच्छे नहीं होते हैं. ये क्रिटिसिज्म है, और इसीलिए ऐसी गॉडेस जो है वो इजी एक्सेस है फॉर द क्रिटिक्स. दोज हु कैन नॉट बी अ पोएट कैन बिकम अ क्रिटिक. जो पोएट नहीं हो सकते वो क्रिटिक होते हैं, ऐसा डॉक्टर सैमुअल जॉनसन को लगता है, और ऐसा उन्होंने बताया भी है. And then in another article that he wrote under the title an allegory on criticism, and it was published in another journal, The Rambler, in 1750. And here he once again talks about the topic criticism, from whom they derive their claim to decide the fate of writers. Who? They means critic. Right? Critics क्या काम करते हैं कि from criticism they derive their claim to decide the fate of the writer. राइटर का फेट डिसाइड कर देते हैं कि ये अच्छा राइटर है और ये खराब राइटर है. ये काम किसका है? ये काम एक्सक्लूसिवली क्रिटिक का है. राइट, डिसाइड द फेट ऑफ द राइटर. क्रिटिसिज्म वाज द एल्डेस्ट डॉटर ऑफ लेबर एंड ऑफ ट्रुथ. एल्डेस्ट डॉटर है लेबर की एंड ट्रुथ की. शी वॉज एट हर बर्थ committed to the care of justice. When criticism was born, it was born with the purpose. And what was the purpose? It was committed to the care of justice and brought up by her in the palace of wisdom. Being soon distinguished by the celestials for her uncommon qualities, she was appointed the governess of fancy and empowered to beat time to the chorus of muses when they sung before the throne of Jupiter. Critics are now the slaves of flattery and malevolence. Here in this essay, Dr. Johnson invents a family of criticism. Right, and criticism was the eldest daughter of truth and labor, and the initial purpose of criticism was to give justice to the works. But finally हुआ क्या? Finally it lost its purpose when it came in the hands of ignorant people, common people, being soon distinguished by the celestials. Who are the celestials here? Celestials are also personified. Celestials means critics. मेटाफर है ये. राइट, celestials. For her uncommon qualities, she was appointed as the governess of fancy. From justice, it became the governess of fancy, and it was empowered. It empowered to beat time to the chorus of the muses when they sung before the throne of Jupiter. Jupiter is the god of gods, जिसको Zeus भी कहते हैं. Right, Jupiter is the Latinized name of Zeus. Critics are now the slaves of flattery and malevolence. The sole purpose of the critic in the time of Dr. Samuel Johnson was only to flatter people, only to flatter the writers. और किस लिए flattering करते थे? To appease the king, to appease the political patrons, and it was very easy to caricature anyone. Right, and criticism lost its very purpose in the hands of such biased, such prejudiced critics. Right, though this was the statement of Dr. Samuel Johnson. All right, and it was an allegory on criticism published in the article. And once again in the Rambler 1751 he wrote another article, another essay, The Prejudices and Caprices of Criticism. The prejudices and caprices of criticism. Actually, why I am telling you the names of these essays? Because UGC can ask anything, you know. Right, it has not been asked before, but UGC never repeats questions. Right, कभी भी पूछ सकती है, and you have to remember the names of the essays at least, and when and where they were published. ये important है. What is the main content that I am telling you? कि इसका main issue क्या है, इसका main content क्या है? 93. The prejudices and caprices of criticism. In trusting therefore to the sentence of a critic, we are in danger not only from that vanity which exalts writers too often to the dignity of teaching what they are yet to learn, from that negligence which sometimes steals upon the most vigilant caution, and that fallibility to which the condition of nature has subjected every human understanding. Here किस बात पर फोकस कर रहा है? यहाँ पर जो अल्टीमेट फोकस है कि वी शुड नॉट बिलीव इन दी writings in the voice of the critics blindly. We should evaluate, we should judge. क्यों नहीं करना चाहिए? Because a critic is always inspired, always influenced by some extrinsic and some intrinsic motives. And such intrinsic and extrinsic motives जो है, they always inspire, they always influence the critics, and ऐसा जो criticism होगा that can be dangerous, right? From 1,000 extrinsic and accidental causes, from everything which can excite kindness or malevolence, veneration or contempt. तो वेनरेशन के, कंटेम्प्ट के हमारे अपने अपने पर्सनल रीजंस होते हैं, पर्सनल विम्स होते हैं, और इसलिए वी शुड नॉट हैव फुल फेथ इन अ क्रिटिक. यू कैन हैव फुल फेथ इन द creative writer but not in the critics. Critics are always influenced by thousands of extrinsic and intrinsic causes and venerations and जो दूसरा उसके लिए वर्ड है veneration के साथ contempt. So you cannot completely believe in the statements of critics. ये अगला statement है. All right, and this statement is from the prejudices and caprices of criticism. कि prejudices and caprices जो है वो critics के हमेशा उसके वर्क को influence करते हैं. So we should avoid such critics. We should not have 100% faith in such issues. Next article, once again published in the Rambler, and the name of the article was The Difficulty of Defining Comedy, Tragic and Comic Sentiments Confounded. Right, and here in this essay he talks about there should not be complete tragedy or complete comedy, even though bifurcation of tragedy and comedy is itself false. जो है वही गलत है, वही नहीं होना चाहिए था. ये हमारे sentiments को बिल्कुल scattered करने का काम करते हैं. If the two kinds of dramatic poetry had been defined only by the effects upon the mind, right? हमको पहले से नहीं decide कर लेना चाहिए कि this is comedy, this is tragedy. We should decide whether it is tragedy or comedy according to their impacts, according to their effects on our mind. Some absurdities might have been prevented, with which the compositions of our greatest poets are disgraced, who for want of some settled ideas and accurate distinctions have unhappily confounded tragedy with comic sentiments. The essence is that tragedy and comedy should be decided on the basis of their impact on the audience, the impact on the reader, and there should not be any demarcation before it is performed. ये कहना है डॉक्टर जॉनसन का in his essay The Difficulty of Defining Comedy, Tragedy, Comedy, Tragic and Comic Sentiments Confounded. All right. Next article, not article. Now we come to his greatest work and the most studious work, the most stupendous work. Our most stupendous work जो है is his Life of Most Eminent English Poets. Dr. Johnson is the first biographical critics. ऐसा नहीं है कि पहले बायोग्राफी लिखी ही नहीं गई थी. आपने प्लूटार्क का नाम सुना होगा. Plutarch has written parallel lives of the eminent Greeks and Romans, and Shakespeare based his Roman plays like Julius Caesar, Antonian Cleopatra, right, on Plutarch's parallel lives that was translated by Thomas North in 1579. But he only talked about the political figures. He talked about the statesmen, and Mr. Johnson talked about the poets who lived just before him. He talked about 52 poets. He wrote the biographies of 52 poets who lived in his age or in the previous age, in the previous century. And he not only talked about the biography, but he also gave the concept of biographical criticism. His work, the prefaces, biographical and critical to the works of English poets. This is the complete title, and once UGC asked the question, what was the complete title of Lives of the पोएट्स, ये टाइटल है. पॉपुलरली नोन एज लाइव्स ऑफ द पोएट्स और समवेयर यू कैन फाइंड द नेम लाइव्स ऑफ द मोस्ट एमिनेंट इंग्लिश पोएट्स. इट वाज अ कलेक्शन ऑफ 52 बायोग्राफीज, 52 biographies in 66 volumes. 52 biographies in 66 volumes, right? And Dr. Johnson was asked by different publishers to write prefaces of a few poets, and in order to write, he completed the prefaces biographical and critical to the works of English poets between 1779 and 81. The most obvious feature of Johnson's lives of the poets is the equipoise between biography and criticism. This is the example of analytical criticism. Analytical criticism, biographical criticism, biographical criticism, as well as literary criticism. 52 biographies of the poets, not in the order of their birth but in the order of their death. उनके डेथ के अकॉर्डिंग अरेंज किया था 52 बायोग्राफीज को. इट इज अ बायोग्राफिकल कम क्रिटिकल अकाउंट ऑफ 52 पोएट्स फ्रॉम अब्राहम कुले टू थॉमस ग्रे, covering a period of 100 years. It is as much a history of the English poetry of this period work of criticism. The best written of these lives are those of Cooley, Milton, Dryden, Addison and Pope. Though he wrote 52 biographies, but out of the 52, the most famous are the life of Cooley, the life of Milton, life of Dryden, life of Addison and life of Pope. Right? And as you know that he was a very harsh critic of John Milton. आते हैं अभी थोड़ी देर में. First life, the life of Cooley, where he talks about metaphysical poets in a very derogatory way. He satirized the metaphysical poets in the life of Cooley, right? And it was John Dryden who coined first the term metaphysics, right? John Dryden had written that done affects metaphysics. Done affects metaphysics. This was the statement of John Dryden. And after almost a century, it was Dr. Samuel Johnson who coined the phrase metaphysical poets. Where did he coin? In the lives of Cooley. Cooley was a metaphysical poet of 17th century, and in the life of Cooley he talked about metaphysical poets. And about metaphysical poets, Dr. Johnson says that they were men of learning, and to show their learning, to show their knowledge was their whole endeavor. पढ़े लिखे लोग थे और उस ज्ञान को बघारना ही उनका मेन काम था, इससे ज्यादा कुछ नहीं. So metaphysical poets were not appreciated by Dr. Samuel Johnson. In fact, they were criticized. और appreciate किसने किया metaphysical poets को? उनके भी 200 साल बाद T.S. Eliot wrote an essay, Metaphysical Poets, and where he says that metaphysical poets combined two sensibilities, जिसको unification of sensibility कहा जाता है, और वो unification of sensibility made those poets rich and excellent. ये जो है T.S. Eliot का स्टेटमेंट था. But in the words of Dr. Samuel Johnson, metaphysical poets were not excellent, they were not good poets. In fact, Dr. Samuel Johnson describes them very derogatorily. Their thoughts are often new but seldom natural. This is the statement. They are new but they are not natural. They are not obvious but neither are they just. And the reader, far from wondering that he missed them, wonders more frequently but what perverseness of industry they were ever found. Their thoughts are often new but seldom natural. This is the statement. Their thoughts are often new but seldom natural. They are not obvious but neither are they just. And the reader, far from wondering that he missed them, wonders more frequently by what perverseness of industry they were ever found. The metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. अपना ज्ञान शो करना ही उनका whole endeavor था, but unluckily resolving to show it in rhyme instead of writing poetry, they only wrote verses. And very often such verses as stood the trial of the finger better than of the air, for the modulation was so imperfect that they were only found to be verses by counting the syllables. They were not natural. They were written only in verse form, but the verse form was also very poor. They combined two dissimilar images, right? They compared two dissimilar things where there was no comparison. They created comparison, right? And this was a bit not suitable for the poets. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons and allusions. Their learning instructs and their subtlety surprises, but the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and though he sometimes admires, is seldom pleased. Right? Admiration तो उनको मिल सकती है, sometimes मिल भी जाती है, but nobody is pleased by the reading of such poetry. They are written in verse form, but verse forms are not very pleasant to the eye, to the ear. कानों को भी अच्छे नहीं लगते. वो है क्या? They seldom please. Discordia conquers. It is a phrase, and discordia conquers means combination of dissimilar images. Right? Combination of dissimilar images. This is the definition of metaphysical poetry. Metaphysical poets combines two dissimilar images. If you would have read the poem Canonization, you could remember this discordia conquers. A combination of dissimilar images are discovery of occult resemblance in things apparently unlike. Two things that are apparently unlike, they are compared. Right? This is called metaphysical conceit. And Dr. Samuel Johnson was against such poetry, against such metaphysical poets in the life of Cooley. And then we come to another life of Milton. And in the life of Milton, he defines poetry. And in the words of Dr. Samuel Johnson, poetry is the art of uniting pleasure with truth. Right? Here he doesn't talk about that poetry is the imitation of nature. Right? Starting from Aristotle till Dryden, poetry was the imitation of nature, imitation of life. But here poetry is the art of uniting pleasure with truth. Truth prevails. Right? Sidney ने क्या कहा था? There is no truth at all in poetry. There is no falsehood at all in poetry. It is far above from truth and false. उससे बहुत ऊपर है. But यहाँ पर poetry जो है, it is the art of uniting pleasure with truth by calling imagination to help of reason. यहाँ पर reason, ये age of reason है. 18th century is called age of prose and reason by मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड. एंड हियर इमेजिनेशन एंड रीजन ये अपने आप में ही एक क्या है, मेटाफिजिकल चीज है कि टू डिसिमिलर चीज कैन नेवर कंबाइन. एंड हियर डॉक्टर सैमुअल जॉनसन ट्राइज टू कंबाइन इमेजिनेशन टू द हेल्प ऑफ रीजन. Right, the purpose, the art, what is poetry? Poetry is the art of uniting pleasure with truth by calling imagination to the help of reason. By calling imagination to help to the help of reason. This is the definition of poetry, right, in the life of Milton. And then after the definition of poetry in the life of Milton, he comes to his elegy Lucidus. And Lucidus is highly satirized by Dr. Samuel Johnson. Dr. Samuel Johnson thinks it can never be an elegy. It can never be an elegy. क्यों नहीं हो सकती? Because if there is leisure for fiction, there is little grief. If you are writing something on somebody's death, तो डेथ जब होगी ना किसी की, आप जब दुखी हो गए तो आप फिक्शनलाइज नहीं कर सकते चीजों को. ये सैमुअल जॉनसन का मानना है. Where there is leisure for fiction, there is little grief, and if you are not grieved, you cannot write an elegy. Lucidus, of which the diction is harsh. Point number 1. The rhymes uncertain. Point number 2. And the numbers unpleasing. Point number 3. What beauty there is, we must therefore seek in the sentiments and images. जो ब्यूटी है कहाँ है? Sentiments and images में. It is not to be considered as the effusion of real passion, for passion runs not after remote illusions and obscure opinions. Actually, Milton had eluded a lot of Greek classical myths in the poem, and Dr. Johnson thinks that if there is grief, if there is sentiment, then sentiments, grief do not require any allusion. और उस एल्यूजन के ग्राउंड पर भी उसको रिजेक्ट किया है. डिक्शन के ग्राउंड पर रिजेक्ट किया है, पोएट्री के ग्राउंड पर रिजेक्ट किया है, राइम के ग्राउंड पर रिजेक्ट किया है, पैशन के ग्राउंड पे रिजेक्ट किया है. पैशन प्लक्स नो बेरीज फ्रॉम द मार्चल एंड एवी, नॉर कॉल्स अपॉन एर्थूस एंड मिनिसियस, nor tells the rough satires and fawns with cloven heel. These are the names that Milton had eluded in his Lucidus, and on the ground of such false allusions, Dr. Samuel Johnson rejects Milton's poem on Lucidus. And सिर्फ इतना ही नहीं, आगे बढ़ करके he says that in this poem there is no nature at all. For there is no truth, there is no art, for there is nothing new. Its forms is that of a pastoral, easy, vulgar, and therefore disgusting. Whatever image it can supply are long ago exhausted, and its inherent improbability always forces dissatisfaction on the mind. Right? So nature, there is no nature because there is no truth. There is no sorrow because everything is fictitious, and there is no art because there is nothing new. जब न्यू नहीं है तो आर्ट नहीं है, तो जब कुछ है ही नहीं तो लिखा क्यों है? और सिर्फ क्या है, ये पास्टोरल है. और मिस्टर, फिर से मिस्टर याद आ जाता है. डॉक्टर सैमुअल जॉनसन वाज अगेंस्ट पास्टोरल पोएट्री, and he appreciates his 3 poems, El Alighiero, El Penseroso, and finally the Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost में कहते हैं Milton is at his peak in Paradise Lost. Though Samuel Johnson satirized, he was not in favor of blank verse, but he favored blank verse in Milton's Paradise Lost, and said that blank verse could be used for such a sublime subject as Milton had chosen. Milton's subject is not the destruction of a city, the conduct of colony, the foundation of an empire. His subject is the fate of worlds, the revolutions of heaven and the earth, rebellion against the supreme king raised by the highest order of created beings, the overthrow of their host and the punishment of their crime, the creation of new race of reasonable creatures, their original happiness and innocence, their four features of immortality and their restoration to hope and peace. और इसी ground पर Milton is appreciated in the poem Paradise Lost. And then we come to the life of Dryden, where he defines Augustan age first. Why the age is called Augustan? He compares the poet of the time to the poets of the Augustan time. वहीं से Augustan age का नाम आता है. And in here, in the biography of Dryden, he says that Dr. John Dryden was the father of criticism, right? Father of criticism यहीं पर कहते हैं. Dryden declares, Johnson declares that Dryden is the father of English criticism, who taught us to determine on principles the merits of composition. And Johnson recognized that the criticism of Dryden is the criticism of poet. In short, it was not based on formulae, but was always alive to what it was dealing with. Neoclassical age is known for the adherence of classical formulas, especially the Latin formulas, but neither Dr. Samuel Johnson nor John Dryden, दोनों ने, they never followed the formula. According to Dr. Johnson, John Dryden was a poet, he was not a critic. And how was he a poet? Poet कैसे थे? Because he did not stick to any set formula, any formula given by others. He wrote whatever he felt, whatever he experienced. He regards Dryden's account of Shakespeare as model of encomiastic criticism. Encomiastic criticism क्या होता है? Encomiastic means होता है to appreciate someone and an epitome of excellence. Dryden ने बोला था शेक्सपियर के बारे में, I admire Johnson but I love Shakespeare. और वो जो लव है वो encomiastic criticism का एक एग्जाम्पल है, ऐसा डॉक्टर सैमुअल जॉनसन को लगता है. And then he comes to another life, and that is the life of Thomas Gray, where he gives the concept of the common reader that was later imbibed by Virginia Woolf for his essays under the title Common Reader. Then he talks about kinds of poetry, versification and poetic diction. And in kinds of poetry he talks about, he satirizes, he criticizes. किसको criticize करते हैं? Pindaric ode को criticize करते हैं. And he appreciates heroic verses, he appreciates the epics. By the general consent of critics, he says the first praise of genius is due to the writer of an epic poem, and that's why he appreciates Mr. John Milton for his epic poem Paradise Lost, as it requires an assemblage of all the powers which are singly sufficient for other compositions. Epic poetry undertakes to teach the most important truths by the most pleasing precepts. For Dr. Samuel Johnson, teaching cannot be separated from poetry, right? Entertainment is one part and teaching is the most important part. Teaching and entertainment cannot be separated. There must be teaching, there must be something to preach in the poetry. और इसलिए Dr. Samuel Johnson is a moralist, right? He was a moralist critic, so he appreciates epic and he is not in favor of Pindaric ode and pastoral poetry. Among the verse forms which made the least impression on him may be mentioned the pastoral and Pindaric ode. Pastoral and Pindaric ode. While he admitted that the pastoral may have pleased in ancient times by its realistic pictures of the countrysides, hills, valleys, streams, shepherds, their flock, in the modern age all these were no more than mere convention, and he was not in favor of any convention. He was in the favor of newness. He was in the favor of something new. Inventiveness के फेवर में होते हैं, स्ट्रिक्ट एडहेरेंस के फेवर में नहीं. इसलिए ही वॉज अगेंस्ट द पास्टोरल पोयम दैट वाज स्टार्टेड बाय थियोक्रिटस फॉलोड बाय वर्जिल एंड देन एडमंड स्पेंसर. Right, he was not in favor of Pindaric ode as well. Pindar was a Greek poet and who started to write ode in the Greek period in honor of someone, in honor of Olympians, in honor of Olympic gods, Olympic games and Olympic winners. और उसको यहाँ पर आकर के he satirized. He is not in favor of such naked elegance and advocate of truth to nature in poetry clothed in naked elegance. यहाँ पर वो उसके खिलाफ होते हैं पास्टोरल के और ओड के. एंड फाइनली द आइडिया ऑफ कॉमन रीडर की बात करते हैं इन द लाइफ ऑफ जो है थॉमस ग्रे. थॉमस ग्रे को तो आप जानते हैं, ही इज वेल फेमस फॉर हिज ओड्स एंड एलिजी. राइट, कौन से ओड्स? ओड्स एंड ड्रामेटिक पोएजी नहीं ना? कौन सा ओड है, याद है कुछ की नहीं? प्रोग्रेस ऑफ पोएजी. Right, progress of poesy, and he is known for the ode on the death of a cat, and he wrote elegy written in a country churchyard, and here he gives the concept of common reader, and इतना ही आपकी एग्जामिनेशन के लिए सफिशिएंट था. और ये तो रही उनके पूरे क्रिटिसिज्म की स्टोरी. अब उनका एक क्रिटिसिज्म का वर्क बचता है, दैट इज प्रीफेस टू शेक्सपियर. And preface to Shakespeare will be discussed in the upcoming lecture, in the next lecture, and you will have to wait for a day for that lecture. Watch the video, write your comments in the comment box, and if still there is any query, any question, you can share with me through the comment box. Comment box is always open. All right, जब हम critics की बात करते हैं, one more point, और वो one more point ये है कि according to Dr. Samuel Johnson, a piece of literature, a piece of poetry should be judged. किसके according? Should be judged according to the rules, according to the society of the time when it was written. You have to transport yourself in the time of the poet. If you are criticizing Shakespeare, don't judge him on the basis of today's formula. Judge him on the basis of Elizabethan age. ये डॉक्टर सैमुअल जॉनसन की ओपिनियन है. हम जब आएंगे शेक्सपियर के टाइम पर, राइट, प्रीफेस टू शेक्सपियर में, एडिशन टू शेक्सपियर में, देन वी विल डिस्कस एट लेंथ. थैंक यू सो मच फॉर बीइंग विद मी. अगर पसंद आएगा तो शेयर जरूर करिएगा, लाइक जरूर करिएगा, और आपका एक शेयर और एक लाइक ही मोटिवेट करता है टीचर को. राइट, आप मुझे मोटिवेट करते रहिएगा अपने शेयर और लाइक से. थैंक यू, ऑल द बेस्ट, गुड लक.